We can't prove anything in history with 100% certainty, especially ancient history, but we can look at the evidence to gain confidence in what happened. And this includes things like archaeology and historical records, which we've talked about in the past couple of weeks. But another type of evidence is the credibility of the people sharing the historical records. And in our case, we want to know if the Bible's authors were reliable. Were they making things up for personal gain? Or were they simply trying to report what they saw? So today we are going to look at 3 pieces of evidence that I believe show the New Testament authors were reliable sources and that their actions point to a genuine effort to record the truth. So the first piece of evidence is that the New Testament authors didn't shy away from including challenging ideas in their text. So one example is that they openly show Jesus's humanity. They record Jesus admitting things like he doesn't know when he'll return, which he says in Mark 13. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And before his crucifixion, they record Jesus being deeply sorrowful, even asking God to take away his suffering if it's possible. He says in Matthew 26, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And then on the cross, they record Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" One of my favorite late pastors explains this a little bit. He says that Jesus was not a demigod, part God and part human, but fully God and fully human at the same time. And so when Jesus didn't know something, or he felt deep sorrow or suffered or even cried out in abandonment, it didn't take away from his divinity. It actually showed just how much he became like us, kind of in the same way that, if you or I put away our humanness for a while and became a different species. So the fact that the gospel writers include these moments hints that they were committed to giving an honest and complete picture of who Jesus was on Jesus's terms, because otherwise they're adding a lot of unnecessary confusion, in my opinion. So another challenging idea that the New Testament authors don't shy away from is Jesus raising the bar on moral standards. So the authors record him saying things like, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. They also say things like, or you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. The authors also record Jesus challenging the common belief that wealth was a sign of God's blessing. He says things like, indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. And these were tough teachings for his audience, and they didn't necessarily want to hear it. Another example of a challenging idea that the New Testament authors include is that Jesus didn't always follow social norms. He didn't treat people the way society expected. For example, in a society with very strict gender norms, they show him allowing women to learn alongside men, which wasn't common at the time, or, he spoke to a Samaritan woman one-on-one. Both of these were seen as inappropriate for the current time. And then Jesus also, spent time with social outcasts like tax collectors and sinners, which caused outrage among religious leaders. We see an example of this in Mark 2, which says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And there are lots of other examples, like when Jesus tells his followers that they need to forgive endlessly, that they should love their enemies, that following him involves persecution and taking up their cross. And so if they were just trying to gain followers, these types of inclusions in the text and Jesus' teachings, they don't help their cause. So another piece of evidence that the New Testament authors are trustworthy is that they include some pretty embarrassing details about themselves. There's a psychology study from the 1980s by Schleicher and Leary that explains how people usually try to show off their strengths and downplay their weaknesses in order to protect their personal image. And so basically, we try to control the way that other people see us and do our best to avoid admitting things that can make us look bad. And so when someone does admit something that makes them look bad, they share a weakness, it tends to be a sign that they're being honest and transparent. Because we don't want to admit these things. So what we do see is that the New Testament authors include a lot of details that don't paint them in the best light. And I'm going to give you just a few examples. One is that the disciples argue over who's the greatest among them. Jesus had told them many times about the value and necessity of serving others in humility, like when he said in Matthew 20 that whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Yet the disciples still argue about who was the greatest. In Luke 9, it says, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Then in Mark 10, we see the disciples asking Jesus to promise them the highest positions in his future kingdom, so showing that they were still more focused on their status than serving others. They didn't really understand what Jesus was about. The authors also talk about how the disciples didn't fully understand Jesus' death and resurrection. Even though Jesus explained it multiple times, they often didn't get it. Like in Mark 9, Jesus tells them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they, the disciples, did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. There's also the time when Jesus rebukes Peter, one of his closest followers, who's often seen as the leader of the disciples. And Jesus is explaining, that he's going to go away and die. And Peter says, never, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus' response to this is, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And so that's definitely a detail that, might have been left out if the authors were trying to make themselves look good, were trying to gain something. The New Testament authors even mention how the disciples had a hard time staying awake and praying with Jesus at a time when he was distressed. Or as Jesus put it, overwhelmed to the point of death. The night before Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus had asked them to stay awake with him, to pray and keep watch in this crucial moment of his life. But instead of being there for him, they fell asleep. Matthew 26 says, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. And things actually got worse before they got better. When Jesus was arrested, all of his disciples ran away in fear for themselves. They left him alone. Mark 14 says, then everyone deserted him and fled. And then later, Peter, who had just boldly said hours earlier that he would never deny Jesus, he would always stick with him, he ended up denying him 3 times back to back. So in Mark 14 it says, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Another detail that might not seem embarrassing at first, or it's not to us, but it's that the New Testament authors include women being the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. You can find this in Mark 16 or in John 20. But this was a time when women's testimonies were not considered reliable in Jewish society. To give you an idea of the attitude, there was even this traditional Jewish prayer that went, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman. Really nice. So for the authors of the New Testament to say that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, that's something that would have made their story harder to believe at the time. And so if they were making it up, it wouldn't be a good choice. Instead, it suggests that they were recording what really happened. Okay. So there's a lot of other examples, like how Jesus's brother James didn't initially believe Jesus was God until after the resurrection, or how the disciple Thomas doubted that Jesus had resurrected until he saw him for himself and was able to, touch his wounds. Um, but I want to move on to the last piece of evidence that I'm covering today, and this takes us beyond the text and focuses more on the actions of the New Testament authors, showing, I think, that they were sincere in their beliefs. So when we look into it, they truly had nothing to gain by believing or sharing the message of Jesus. Instead, by doing so, they faced severe consequences, including imprisonment, beatings, and in many cases, martyrdom. So just a few examples. After the resurrection, Peter, the one who had previously just disowned Jesus 3 times, and he was in hiding with the other disciples, he went on to preach, perform miracles, spread the gospel to the Gentiles, and play a key role in leading the early church. He also wrote 2 books of the New Testament, and eventually his faith caused him to be executed by the Emperor Nero. Tradition holds that he was crucified upside down by his own request, that they were going to crucify him, and he didn't feel that he was worthy of being killed the same way Jesus was. There's an excerpt that says, Peter, who by the command of Christ endured the cross, and when he was condemned to be crucified, requested that he might not be nailed to the cross in the same way as his Lord, and so was crucified head downward as he desired. We can also consider Paul, who wrote almost half of the New Testament. So Paul was initially an intense persecutor of Christians, so much that he even oversaw the stoning of other Christians. But then he had a transformative experience when he was traveling on the road to Damascus, where he saw a vision of Jesus. He temporarily lost his sight, and at some point that led him to becoming one of the most influential apostles. He became convinced that Jesus was God. He spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. He wrote countless letters. Many became the New Testament. And this led to him enduring beatings and imprisonment and shipwreck for his faith. And he also became a martyr. The Bible doesn't explicitly describe Paul's death, but there is evidence from early church tradition that he was beheaded under the Emperor Nero, and we see evidence of this from Eusebius in his work Ecclesiastical History, that says, but the great Paul, who was both an apostle and a teacher of the Gentiles, after his own testimony, when he had reached the limits of the West and had been for a long time in the service of Christ, in his final period of his life, was brought to Rome, where after a long time of imprisonment, he was beheaded by Nero's orders. This is confirmed by the ancient and universally acknowledged tradition of the church. A third example is James, the brother of Jesus. So before the resurrection, James was skeptical of Jesus's claims to divinity, but after the resurrection, James became a prominent leader in the early church in Jerusalem. He wrote the book of James in the New Testament, and James ultimately died for his faith as well. So according to the historian Josephus, who we talked about last week, this is a non-Christian historian, he mentions James and James' death in his work Antiquities of the Jews, where he writes, Ananus convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had accused them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. And there are many other examples that I can give. In fact, all but one of the disciples are believed to have been martyred for professing their faith in Jesus. The authorities of Ethiopia reportedly beheaded Matthew. The people of Alexandria martyred Mark. Soldiers in India drove a spear through Thomas. And various traditions suggest that Bartholomew, another disciple, was beheaded by a king in Armenia, or flayed alive or crucified. So the only disciple we know of, who's also an author, who wasn't martyred, was John, but he was still tortured and exiled for his beliefs. And this is significant because many people are willing to die for something they think is true. We see this in the news all the time. But no one dies for something that they know is not true. And the New Testament writers were in a unique position to know whether or not Jesus had risen from the dead, because they were eyewitnesses of the time. If they had fabricated their accounts, they would have had every reason to abandon their claims when they were threatened with this persecution. And as you saw, they initially did. As soon as Jesus was arrested, right, Peter denied knowing him. The disciples all went into hiding, fearing for their own lives. Yet something transformed them from these fearful fugitives into being bold preachers who were willing to profess and die for their beliefs. And we need an answer for this. In my opinion, the most logical answer is that they really did encounter the risen Christ, and that's what gave them this unshakable confidence in their testimony. If you are a non-Christian, I'd love to hear what you think it is. But as John Stott says, if anything is clear from the Gospels and Acts, it is that the apostles were sincere. They may have been deceived, if you like, but they were not deceivers. Hypocrites and martyrs are not made of the same stuff. So again, nothing I'm saying today proves that the Bible is true. You cannot prove anything in history with 100% certainty, but I do think that these three things, that the New Testament authors include challenging teachings, that they include embarrassing details about themselves, and that they were willing to die for their beliefs, that they had the ability to verify, show that they were being honest, that they weren't making stuff up in order to get rich or powerful, because if anything, they had a lot to lose by sharing their messages. So this is where we're going to break for today. We'll do more next week. But if you have questions about this topic, the Bible or Christianity, please put them in the comments and I will try to answer there or in a future video. And then if you want to see more content like this, you've got options. You can check out the books that I've linked to in my description. I especially recommend Case for Christ or Why Trust the Bible. Or you can click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video, and I'll see you next week. Thanks so much.